Hello everyone, sorry for jumping in before the episode, but I just want to tell you all about the Thinking in English Patreon. Patreon is a way for you guys to support Thinking in English and receive some amazing benefits. We have conversation clubs at least 6 times a week, allowing you to practice your English speaking. We offer weekly discussion sessions with English tutors, including me, where you can ask any questions you have. We have a Discord server and chat rooms, so you can talk and meet other English learners and practice English. I release bonus episodes every Friday, and depending on your subscription level, there are also free English group classes and one-on-one conversations with me available. There are also some new and exciting new benefits coming in the next few weeks, so join now. I'm currently offering 7-day free trials if you join right now. Click the link in the description or go to www.patreon.com/thinkinginenglish to join now. Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level English learners. The largest dam in Ukraine collapsed, and it is likely the disaster was due to a deliberate attack. If it was deliberate, it would be one of the most severe acts of environmental terrorism in history. Let's discuss the collapse, talk about environmental terrorism, and discuss the risks and history of destroying the environment in war and conflicts. You can find the full transcript of today's episode for free over on the Thinking in English blog. Here is today's vocabulary list. Dam. A wall built across a river that stops the river's flow and collects the water, especially to make an artificial lake that provides water for an area. For example, the Aswan High Dam is on the River Nile in Egypt. Collapse. To fall down suddenly because of pressure or having no strength or support. For instance, thousands of buildings collapsed in the earthquake. Counter-offensive. A set of attacks that defend against enemy attacks. For example, Ukraine is about to start its counter-offensive against Russia. Blow up. To destroy something or kill someone with a bomb, or to be destroyed or killed by a bomb. For example, they threatened to blow up the plane if their demands were not met. Contaminate. To make something less pure or make it poisonous. As in, much of the coast has been contaminated by nuclear waste. Ecological. Relating to ecology, the relationship between living things and their environment, or the environment itself. As in, the oil spill was a major ecological disaster. Destructive. Causing great and irreparable damage. For example, people can't comprehend the destructive power of nuclear weapons. Flooding. The condition of becoming filled or covered with a large amount of water. As in, rain caused flooding that washed out bridges and covered roads. Last week, the Nova Kakhovka Dam in Ukraine collapsed. It will be the most destructive environmental disaster in Europe for decades. Entire towns and villages have been washed away, massive amounts of farmland ruined, millions of animals and plants wiped out. We still don't know exactly why the dam collapsed. It is currently under Russian control, and Russia will not allow independent investigators to visit the site. Most Western countries and organizations, as well as Ukraine, have blamed Russia. They suggest Russia either deliberately blew up the dam or is responsible as it is an aggressive foreign power invading a neighbouring country. Without inspecting the site, it's impossible to know what happened. Dams are not necessarily the easiest thing to destroy, and engineers examining satellite photos have suggested it looks like an explosion inside the dam is the most likely reason. The dam collapse also benefits Russia more than it does Ukraine. Ukraine is currently preparing for a counter-offensive against Russian invaders, and the collapsed dam will certainly slow down the Ukrainian army in that region. Russia has claimed it was caused by a Ukrainian missile attack, but they have not produced any evidence, despite being in control of the dam. Russia says Ukraine destroyed the dam to stop water being supplied to the Crimea, the region of Ukraine illegally annexed by Russia almost 10 years ago. Reports from the Ukraine suggest a lot of Russian soldiers were unprepared or surprised for the flooding, with the Ukrainian army witnessing units of Russian troops and equipment being swept away. However, it is unlikely that a Ukrainian missile would be able to destroy the dam, because it's really difficult to destroy dams. The famous dam busters of the British Royal Air Force used unique methods to destroy German dams in World War II, including bouncing bombs across the water, as you need massive explosives and you need to hit a very specific area to cause a complete collapse. It's not as simple as just firing a missile. The side responsible for the destruction or the motive behind it is not the focus of this episode. I don't know who did it, although it seems more likely that Russia was responsible right now, and I know I have both listeners from Ukraine and Russia. But whoever blew up the dam has committed one of the most damaging environmental events in European history. It is being described as an act of environmental terrorism, a war crime, and ecocide. Homes have been destroyed, farmland will now be unsuitable for agriculture for years, maybe decades, water supply has been interrupted and may possibly be contaminated with chemicals and oil. The massive reservoir behind the dam will soon be empty, meaning thousands of animals and fish living in it will be killed. Oil from the dam's heavy machinery is likely leaking into the river and spreading across the region. It's estimated as much as 150 tons of oil may be leaking into the river. 1 litre of oil can contaminate 1 million litres of water, meaning 150 billion litres of water are now at risk of contamination. Oil lays on top of the water in a very thin layer, starving the plants and animals in the water of oxygen and sunlight. The dam is the critical water source for the entire region of southeastern Ukraine, for drinking water and for farming. Without water for their irrigation systems, many farms in the region will begin to dry out and turn into deserts. It will be an environmental and ecological crisis. If the collapse was a deliberate consequence of an attack, it would be possible to describe it as an act of environmental terrorism. Using the destruction of the environment to cause damage and panic is terrorism. Today, I want to look at this concept of environmental terrorism in a little more detail. But first, let's discuss terrorism. Terrorism is a term that dominates news headlines and always captures our attention. But what exactly is it? In most definitions, terrorism involves the use of violence or intimidation to achieve political, ideological, or religious goals. It is a strategy employed by individuals or groups to instill fear and panic within a society. In other words, to produce terror. Terrorist acts come in various forms and are driven by diverse motives. Perhaps the most well-known form over the past few decades has been religious terrorism. Religious terrorism comes from extremist interpretations of religion. It involves acts of violence committed in the name of a particular religion or ideology. Examples of religious terrorism include the devastating 9/11 attacks orchestrated by Al-Qaeda and the series of bombings carried out by groups such as ISIS. But religious terrorism is not the only or even most common form of terrorism. Ideological terrorism, based on radical political ideologies or extreme beliefs, is also a constant threat. These terrorists target governments, institutions, or specific groups they perceive as opposing their ideology. Examples include the Red Brigades in Italy and the Weather Underground in the United States. Separatist terrorism is another form which comes from the aspirations of ethnic or regional groups for independence or self-determination. These terrorists strive to establish separate states or regions through violent means. The Basque separatist group, ETA, in Spain, and the Kurdistan Workers' Party in Turkey serve as notable examples of separatist terrorism. And there is also state-sponsored terrorism, which occurs when governments provide support, funding, or safe havens to terrorist groups. It is often employed as a tool of foreign policy to destabilize other nations or further political objectives. There have been allegations against many governments regarding involvement in terrorist activities, including Iran, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and even democracies like the UK in Northern Ireland and the US in Cuba and other places. But today, we want to look at a more specific form of terrorism that poses a unique threat: environmental terrorism. Environmental terrorism can be defined as the deliberate use of violence, threats, or sabotage to cause harm to the natural environment or exploit it for political or ideological gain. Unlike other forms of terrorism, environmental terrorism targets ecosystems, natural resources, and infrastructure related to the environment. What sets environmental terrorism apart from other forms of terrorism is its focus on ecological damage and the disruption of activities that harm the environment. This could include poisoning water sources, setting fire to forests, damaging critical infrastructure like pipelines, or releasing hazardous substances into the environment. It's important to distinguish environmental terrorism from eco-terrorism, as the terms are often used interchangeably. While both involve actions related to the environment, there are notable differences between them. Eco-terrorism involves acts of terror in defense of the environment, while environmental terrorism involves acts of terrorism which destroy the environment. For example, an eco-terrorist may destroy roads and vehicles of companies destroying forests, while an environmental terrorist may burn down the entire forest to cause as much damage as possible. Historically, there have been significant incidents of environmental terrorism that highlight its destructive consequences. Famous examples include the USA's use of Agent Orange in the Vietnam War, or the Iraqi army's setting fire of oil fields in Kuwait. So let's take a deeper look at some of these examples of environmental terrorism, which maybe could even be described as environmental warfare. One distressing example of environmental terrorism is the use of Agent Orange during the Vietnam War. Agent Orange was a herbicide and defoliant, so something that kills plants, sprayed by the US military to eliminate forests and crops used by their enemies. Vietnam has many forests and jungles, and the USA wanted to remove these so that their soldiers would have an easier time fighting. However, the chemicals used in Agent Orange caused extensive environmental damage and severe health effects for both humans and the ecosystem. The widespread contamination of soil, water sources, and vegetation resulted in the destruction of forests, loss of biodiversity, and long-term health problems for millions of innocent people. During the Gulf War in 1991, Iraqi forces committed environmental terrorism by setting fire to hundreds of oil wells in Kuwait. The deliberate burning of oil fields created massive plumes of smoke, polluting the air and causing significant ecological damage. The fires released toxic chemicals and pollutants into the atmosphere, impacting human health, damaging ecosystems, and also contributing to climate change. The environmental and economic consequences of this act were devastating, requiring substantial efforts for extinguishing the fires and restoring the affected areas. In more recent times, groups in the Gaza Strip have used balloons to set fire to woodland in Israel. Forests near the border areas have been deliberately set ablaze, causing widespread damage to natural habitats, wildlife, and agricultural lands. These acts of arson are often carried out as a means of protest or retaliation, but their ecological impact extends far beyond the intended target. The destruction of forests and the release of pollutants during the fires contributes to soil erosion and loss of biodiversity. And similarly, a group known as Children of Fire have been involved in the use of forest fires as a tactic in their conflict with the Turkish government. The group has intentionally ignited forest fires as a mean of disrupting infrastructure, damaging the economy, and undermining Turkish authorities. However, these fires have resulted in extensive damage, destroying vast forested areas, displacing wildlife, and exacerbating the already fragile environmental conditions in the affected regions. One of the most significant consequences of environmental terrorism is the severe damage inflicted upon ecosystems. When acts of environmental terrorism disrupt or destroy these ecosystems, it can have far-reaching and long-lasting effects. For instance, arson attacks on forests or the deliberate contamination of water sources can lead to habitat destruction and the loss of biodiversity. Forests are home to countless plants and animal species, as well as absorbing carbon dioxide and regulating water. The disruption caused by environmental terrorism can lead to the effects throughout the food chain. When key species are eliminated or their habitats destroyed, it can result in imbalances, such as rises in the number of certain species and the decline of others. Furthermore, the dangers of environmental terrorism extend beyond ecological damage. There are risks to public safety, as such events can lead to environmental disasters and more pollution. Destruction of natural resources can negatively impact the livelihoods of local communities who depend on it. For example, poisoning water sources can lead to water scarcity, crop failures, and the loss of traditional fishing grounds, depriving communities of their basic needs and economic stability. So, this episode started by discussing the consequences of the collapse of Ukraine's largest dam. Environmentally, ecologically, and economically, the damage will be catastrophic. Ukrainian President Zelensky described it as an environmental bomb of mass destruction. It will take years, decades for the region to recover from the flooding. If it was a deliberate act, I think it certainly fits the description of environmental terrorism. Its intention would have been to cause as much damage to infrastructure and the region as possible, discouraging Ukrainian action or counter-offensives. Moreover, if Russia was responsible, it would also be a clear war crime. Will the destruction of the dam prevent a Ukrainian counter-offensive against Russia? No. Ukraine is about to begin, or perhaps already begun, an attempt to force Russia out of its territory. But will Ukraine succeed? Well, we'll have to wait and see what happens. So here is today's final thought. The collapse of the largest dam in Ukraine has resulted in a devastating environmental disaster with catastrophic consequences for the region. Whether it was an intentional act or not, the damage caused is immense and will have long-lasting effects. The incident raises the concept of environmental terrorism, which involves the deliberate use of violence or sabotage to harm the natural environment for political or ideological gain. Environmental terrorism poses a unique threat, as it targets ecosystems and critical environmental infrastructure. The collapse of the dam in Ukraine, if proven to be deliberate, would not only qualify as an act of environmental terrorism, but also a war crime, with severe implications for the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia. But what do you think? Do you think the environment should never be targeted in war? Or do you think that the environment is fair game, something that can be exploited during conflicts? Let me know by leaving a comment on this episode of Thinking in English. You can comment on Spotify, comment on the transcript, Thinking in English blog, it's the links in the description, or you can send me a message on Instagram if you'd like. This episode has been slightly more controversial, I guess, than my recent episodes. So if you're annoyed or angry at this topic, please don't be angry at me. I try to be as balanced and fair as possible. And if you're interested in supporting Thinking in English, it's a great time to do it now. We currently have a 7-day free trial to Patreon, allowing you to try my conversation clubs, try our study groups, join our Discord, and listen to a few bonus episodes for free for 7 days. So click the link in the description for a 7-day free trial to Patreon. Also, we have English classes every Monday and Wednesday. That's at Thinking in English classes. You can use the code TRIAL50 for a 50% discount to those classes. And yeah, support me on Instagram, follow the YouTube channel, and thank you. See you all next time. Goodbye.